So welcome to ELT in Chile podcast. This is a podcast where we interview researchers, teachers, and other experts. And today, well, thank you, Graham, for accepting our invitation. So we're going to have many questions for you. So yeah, we interviewed Graham maybe, I don't know, a few years ago, but maybe
Yeah, a few
people,
years
yeah,
ago now.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm going to read, let's say your brief bio data. Probably you have many pages, but yeah, we're going to start with
no,
something
no.
brief. All right. So Graham Hall has worked in English language teaching for over 30 years as a teacher, teacher educator, and researcher and author. Having taught in Europe and in the Middle East, he spent over 20 years working at Northumbria University, leaving university this summer. He's now a professor emeritus, thinking about what to do next, which is, well, probably very exciting for you, Graham. So,
Ah, yeah. It's been a change. You don't think you've been institutionalized, but then after 26 years, you find out that you have. So it's been good. It's a real change, and I'm enjoying it so far.
uh, very good. And also, we saw that, well, that you, I mean, there's a new book coming out. I don't know if it's already came out or if it's coming out
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
next couple of
It
months.
came out in October, I
All
think.
right. All right. Very good. And yeah, we're going to, let's say, add a link so you people can actually buy your book.
Sure.
So let's start with the questions that we have prepared for you. So
Ah,
yes, absolutely. All right, Graham. So let's say to give some context from your book, so how
yeah.
let's like kind of maybe give a sort of context. So when do we start going from like a method era, Graham, to a post-method era, in your opinion? How
Well, aha. You see, I guess that's what the book is trying to get at.
yeah.
It's asking the question of was there ever really a methods era anyway? Um, so the idea bit behind the book, and this is drawing on the work of people like Richard Smith and Scott Thornbury, is that for most language teaching publications and most language teaching discussions and discourse work on this kind of assumption that there was a sequence of methods through the language teaching profession, and I'm sure people listening to this podcast will be familiar with this kind of idea. Early 20th century, there was grammar translation, and then there was the direct method, and then we went to audiolingualism in the 1950s, and then humanistic language teaching, community revolution, task-based learning, CLIL, blah blah blah, and then post method happened in the 90s, and we can go back to some of that later. And while the literature suggests that, and while that was certainly the focus of many publications in those eras, and if you go back to the 1920s, you'll see people like writing about the direct method, and if you go back to the 50s, people were writing about audiolingualism and all the rest of it. I think we what I'm trying to get at is we have to ask is who in the world of language teaching was actually teaching like that, and was that sequence valid, or did that really happen in most classrooms around the world?
Yeah.
And so we have this kind of strange juxtaposition of what the sort of classical history of ELT is said to be, and yet I'm reckoning 90% of the classrooms in the world that didn't happen. And perhaps still doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so the book was trying to get at this distinction between the idea that methods exist on paper, methods existed in some classrooms, methods provide us with a structure for thinking about what we do in the classroom. But if we think of the history of ELT as this sequence of methods, well, we might want to question that. Certainly in some parts of the world, yeah, that might have happened, but in many parts of the world, it didn't. So I've gone completely away from your original question, but when did methods happen? When did it change? Well, we could answer that question in 10 different ways. If we want to look at the literature, we'd say there was a methods history until, let's say, the late 1980s, and then post-method arrived. But then if we look at the realities, I think we'll find that's not quite what was happening in most places.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we're all familiar with, all those
Yeah.
names and also, like the direct method or grammar translation. And then, yeah, when people like, of course, the issue was like, okay, so how are we going to put all this theory into practice? And I think now that's why even in language classes right now, I think we're using like, eclectic or whatever works
Exactly. And
in
and
our
I guess
context.
That's what language. There's a nice quote by. Let me try and think. It's probably Widdowson because he always comes up with nice. Oh no, it's Sherwood Smith. For language teaching is the art of the possible. You know, that's the focus for teachers, isn't it? What works on a Monday morning. So that's not to discount all the ideas and the discussions underpinning individual methods, because I think they're a really great stimulus for us as teachers to think about what we do. But if we try and tell the history of language teaching through methods, I think we kind of quickly run into problems.
Wow, this is quite interesting. And I was also thinking, um, post method as a concept. How does that seem to conceptualize and problematize classroom practices compared to a method? I mean, that's what we talked about just now. That basically, whilst methods existed in research and in teacher education,
Yeah.
what happens in the classroom is a highly individual practice, right? And kind of liberating yourself from this, I need to follow a certain method in arriving at post method and my understanding of it.
Mm.
Um, how does that how does that appear in the classroom? And how do learners, or how could learners and teachers benefit from that,
And
if they benefit from
yeah, I think if always a good word.
it? If
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it depends what, as no doubt this podcast will reveal. I'm a terrible pedant. I like to play with words quite a lot. I suppose it depends what we mean by post method. I
mm,
mean, um, one of the sort of potentially strange contradictions of the idea of post method is that it it sets itself up as being against or after method, but it continues this idea of a sequence in language teaching. Um,
mm,
and so perhaps an assumption of look, listen how much I'm hedging. An assumption of some of the literature around post method is that it came into fruition and started to emerge in the 1990s and what have you. Um, but are we really saying that there weren't ideas of post method before that? And I think if we conjure ourselves back to elements of the history of language teaching way back when, in the the depths of time, to people like Jesperson and stuff at the turn of the 1900s to the 20th century, we'll find them also trying to write sort of anti-method texts and sort of
mhm,
come up with flexibility and
Yeah.
fluidity and teacher-led classrooms and things like that. So that's one way of addressing the question. The other way of addressing the question is of course perhaps the person most significantly associated with the idea of post method, certainly in its kind of, well, it's a long time. It seems like yesterday to me, but it's actually a long time ago now, isn't it? The 1990s and early 2000s. Kumari Vadivelu. I mean, he's the name most associated with it, and he does put learner and teacher autonomy and learner and teacher decision making at the heart of post method, and a acknowledgement of context and a reaction to contextual issues and things like that. But I think it's interesting to perhaps think that although lots of us would defer to, well, that's what post method is, there are, and Kumar himself also suggests there are other frameworks of post method. I mean, in the early 90s, a fellow Stern proposed there were kind of three axes on which any classroom could be placed.
Mm.
Um, Kumar also noted that you'll have come across Dick Allwright and Judith Hanks's idea of exploratory practice was a very post method kind of classroom approach where you put learner decision making into understanding their own classroom at the heart of it. So I think all kind of iterations of post method do something, elevate teacher decision making and a recognition of context and a recognition of teachers and learners' own priorities in the classroom. But we can take different routes and different authors towards that, I think. Uh, Albeit Kumari Vadivelu's work is perhaps the most well known
mhm.
in recent years.
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
is also quite interesting when you think about like I find it quite interesting what you just said about like it almost sounds like classroom micromanagement,
Ah,
where
well, yes,
where
that's
you
very
decide
interesting.
what's good for your classroom, what's beneficial for your learners, right? But then most schools, like when we go to secondary education, for example, they are dependent on a state curriculum. So
Well,
it's also a good question, how much liberty does the teacher and the students have to
ah,
actually micromanage their classrooms, given that there's a macro structure determining what happens in the classroom, more or less?
I think this is the central tension, isn't it? In in the field, let's say, and in many publications in the field. So I've been very fortunate to work on teacher education programs and a master's in teacher education program, and also my own writing. And I suppose I'm not alone in this. It's quite I don't mean idealistic as in a call for social justice, although that's in there clearly, and like
Mm,
everybody, you don't say I don't want social justice, but I suppose a lot of language teaching literature and discussions around language teaching idealize the flexibility and
Mm.
the autonomy that teachers have.
Yeah.
mm,
And I as a teacher educator could say, oh, teachers must think for themselves, which I absolutely genuinely believe. I could say that all the time. And yet we know that 99.9% of teachers are working in situations where the national curriculum, as you say, tells you
What to do, what
what
to
you
teach.
should, and I'm doing my little scare quotes,
no,
do. And we know that parents, when we're teaching young learners and teenagers, exam results matter to people,
Yeah,
you
no,
know.
yeah,
Uh, and it's this juxtaposition all the time, isn't it, between talking about the possibilities for teachers and learners and what they might be able to think through for themselves and implement for themselves and the realities of the classroom situation. I suppose just to throw it back to the discussion of method and post method per se, um, what I like about the concepts, I mean, I've problematized them quite a lot. What I like about the concepts, it's the kind of thing where if a teacher has time to think, what, why do I do what I do?
mm,
mm,
Thinking through some of the principles behind language teaching, whether that's post method or a particular method, might lead them to understand, and presumably understanding helps us as individuals. It's a first step to developing what we do. I hesitate to say improving because that's what I try to avoid. So develop, but yeah, I think there is. I think you've highlighted the key tension between so many publications about teacher reflection, teacher autonomy, uh, teacher development, and the tensions that many teachers around the world live in. And I think that goes back to the idea of, we say that teachers follow a particular method, but they don't because there's all
yeah,
sorts of constraints. The
mm,
realities are different from the literature, don't they?
yeah,
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 absolutely. Yeah, and I mean one of the points that you said, maybe this tension or like something that I really liked was like, yeah, exam results matter. Like they have consequences, they have like, and also so then what you just said, like, so how can we or should we move the focus from of this important discussion from teachers to learners, especially for example, if we think about learner autonomy, not only teacher autonomy but also learner or
Mm.
autonomy. One of your books, you
Mm.
also mentioned like the idea of maybe a good language learner. So
Ah, yes, indeed.
yeah, so
But that's very interesting though. The concept of a good language learner it's fascinating, isn't it? Because if we think so, I you know I, I think yourselves and most listeners will know this, but we'll recap. The concept of a good language learner emerged in the sort of late 70s in our field, didn't it? You get this idea that suddenly learners are individuals and what can we learn from effective learners and all the rest of it. But if we look at the characteristics that came out, then it's all about learner autonomy and decision making and being motivated and proactive and all that themselves. And that's clearly a particular view of good language learning and good language learners, but language learning involves quite a lot of effort. you know, and a good language learner is somebody who's prepared to put the time in, and
yeah,
and 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 find their own strategies and all of those things. So I've lost my thread a bit, but I think the good language learner, um, it's hard to pin down. It's an elusive concept. There's surely got to be more than one model, and I think I read something by Philip Kerr yesterday about the impacts of AI
Mm.
on language
Yeah.
teaching, and and one of the points, as I understand it, and I'm sure if Philip ever hears this, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, it was kind of language learning will always continue, and AI will help that through things like apps, whether we like the way the apps work and whether they're quite as effective as they claim to be, we might question.
Mm.
It's the impact on teachers and teaching that's we might be concerned about.
Mm.
I'll just so so good language learner, the extent to which good language learners need language teachers is being brought particularly into focus. Some of the questions, I'm going on a bit, but some of the questions that you sent through, what are the future of language teaching? Well, I've no idea, but AI will have some impact,
Mm.
and I think AI will have an impact on how learners learn or what learners do in
Mm.
order to try to learn,
Mm.
what they access.
Mm.
That's one thing, and that will probably provide with more possibilities, some more effective, some less effective. And and I'm not trying to sell AI. I think there's all sorts of things that won't be effective, but the impact on teachers will be something to watch. And I kind of say that with a falling into a intonation.
No, certainly. I think AI is going to impact the way, maybe yes, how teachers teach, but also how students use the language, how they
Yes.
interact
Ah,
with
yeah. Well, that's
English as a
interesting.
medium, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I read an interesting piece the other day where they're talking like interaction amongst young students or like young learners has changed
Yeah.
dramatically from consuming to actually interacting
Mm,
with media through AI,
yeah.
um, which brings a whole host of quite interesting implications with it when when you're used to talking to a machine basically and then you put out in the real world and it would be interesting to see how much this actually simulates or how much
Yeah.
the simulation of a conversation does help
Helps.
students
Yeah.
improve communication and social
Yeah.
skills. Let's not
Absolutely.
forget social skills and interpersonal skills.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. All of these
Right?
things. I mean, they're all very it's all kind of elusive and up in the air at the moment, but there'll be some benefits, I guess, but I can see lots of problematic issues going back to where we started
Yeah.
with regard to social justice, autonomy, accentism, all of those
Mhm.
varieties, all of those things stand to be let's just say affected
Yeah.
Yeah,
uh, by
no,
artificially generated language.
absolutely. And I myself, I have been doing quite a bit of research on conversations,
Ah,
face-to-face conversations. So basically, when we think about the course book conversations that we often have,
yeah.
which is quite clean, Bob, something like, "Hello, Timmy, how are you doing? Oh, I'm well, Lenny. Thank you very much." Which no one really talks like that, really. And then you feed this or you practice conversation with an AI tool that's I'm not sure if this actually helps the field of teaching conversation to talk about a very narrow aspect right now.
Mm, mm.
And
Well,
I'm sure there's like other areas that also are affected by this type of artificial um, communication.
well, I saw an interesting post the other day. Similarly, somebody was suggesting, and I think they were putting it up to provocative, that you could teach conversation by teaching, the conversation with all the ellipsis in there. So you go,
Yeah.
"How you
Mhm.
doing? Fine." Here's nothing. You know,
Isn't so really friendly.
it was great, and that's how kind of conversation is. That's how we speak.
Yeah.
And then the response was, of course, that might be conversation, but that's not necessarily pedagogically useful
Sure.
because
Mhm.
you're not extracting the longer structures for either to teach as a rote if it's beginners, how are you? I'm fine, thank you, and you, or to show language learners the patterns from which they might you know um, inductively either inductively or deductively work out how language works more broadly. And I think that's quite an interesting aspect of what happens with tools. And it's also underpins, and this takes us back to the idea of method and post method. It underpins how we think learning takes place and what's the best sort of
Hmm.
language to provide for learners and what we think learners might do with the language in order to learn. So all the stuff about, let's use natural language, and it's intuitively it sounds the logical thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, of course you'd use natural, whatever. Let's put to the side what natural language is, because your natural language might be different to mine. So let's
Yeah.
just park that particular issue. But using natural language sounds really logical. And of course, there is a case for that, particularly when you're trying to develop students' fluency and their receptive skills to deal with somebody like me talking at 100 miles an hour. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily the most useful language for extrapolating those other aspects of language that ultimately they will need to engage with in order for their language to develop.
Hmm.
And I think if one of the reasons, despite the fact I'm sort of discounting method as a global phenomenon, one of the reasons why I think it's quite interesting for teachers to be able to think through at some point in their careers is that different methods see learning as taking place in different ways. Do we induct? Do we deduct? Is it worth doing stuff explicitly? Is it worth just thinking, well, learners taking on implicitly? And the way we think about those different ways of learning might lead us to use language in different ways in the classroom or provide learners with different language texts, if you like, from which they will learn or acquire language.
That's true. And I was also one of the things that we see in the field of ELT and TESOL particularly is that we have this idea from global trends to local
Yeah,
contexts, right? That used to be and probably still is a dilemma in the field. But it's an important thing to consider because we talk about methods, we talk about post methods, we talk about this concept of how do we actually teach English successfully or effectively.
yeah,
Um, but it could be argued that an ESL teacher, shall we say, who sits in Toronto, has a very different context to an EFL teacher who sits somewhere in a remote area with a classroom that has a few chairs, a table, and maybe
oh,
an
100%. Yeah,
overhead projector.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
how do we, when we talk about post method, or even when we talk about a method, that method may be very different depending on
Well, I
where we
think
are on the globe.
I completely agree, and I think that's where, and this brings us back to the dilemma of how much freedom do teachers have to think things through. But that's where teacher knowledge, teachers' local knowledge, and teachers' local expertise
Mhm.
comes in, and that's
Hmm.
ultimately where the implementation of pedagogic practice takes place. So, for example, and I would say this because I like to think that what I do is just about right. I don't think I live and work in the northeast of England. Um, I know quite a lot about what the literature says about how language learning might take place. I know quite a lot about what the literature or people say about how languages might be taught. But no, that doesn't mean I know anything about how languages are or should be taught in, say, Chile or Rwanda or Cameroon or Thailand. I don't know. I don't live there. I don't know those classroom contexts. So I think, and I believe this very strongly, for someone like me who produces books about the field, if you like, I think the most we can do is say, this is what people say.
Mm.
How does this work in your context? Does this work in your context? If it doesn't work, why not? If it does work, why? And if you've never thought about it, could it possibly? Maybe yes,
Mm.
maybe no. I don't think it's for somebody like. I mean, I'm being at the far end of the spectrum, but I don't think it's for somebody like me to turn around and say, well, this is how teaching should take place in your context, because you know I don't know enough about it. All I can say is these seem to be the possibilities. There you go. Now that puts a big burden, and that's quite post method, but that puts a big burden on teachers as well, because teachers do want generally um, people in a position to read the literature, provide them with answers. So you can kind of guide people to the questions, but then ultimately, I think certainly if they then get filtered through people who are more locally informed to work on teacher development, teacher education, then that's the next step. But I think there's, I suppose we're talking about that global, local thing. What's the term now? Decentering, all of that,
Yeah.
decentering the possession, profession, even to the extent of decolonization. Or I think all people in the centre can do is say this is what people think, this is what seems to have worked here and there, but how about yourself?
And that's also an interesting point, and I think this could actually hint at another problem. All this communication, I sometimes feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I sometimes feel that this line of discourse is quite unidirectional. It's mostly
Yes.
researchers suggesting things that teachers could do, but teacher feedback is, I mean, quite understandably, rather scarce, isn't it? And
I
also,
That's a
like,
very
I think
valid point.
teaching in this sense is a very isolated process, a very, which obviously
Right.
is the result of it being a localized event, shall we say.
Yeah.
But some more participation in a way in the form of feedback would be quite interesting, right?
I really agree with that. I think it's interesting you say that teaching is an isolating or an isolated practice. So clearly, we tend to, if we work in a school, we follow the same curriculum broadly. Our learners are
Hmm.
going for the same kinds of assessments broadly, probably follow the same textbook. And yet, as you walk down the corridor of three, if there were three English language teachers in three different classrooms, supposedly doing exactly the same lesson, the lessons would look different. I mean, that's just
Yes.
we kind of we don't even have different to different degrees, but there would be differences. And the
Hmm.
differences come from what you were mentioning earlier about learners and teachers being different and different interactions in the classroom. But I think what's also interesting is that I think teaching is when you close the door of your classroom as a teacher, that's you. It's you and the learners. And and
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
and and we've all been subject to observation, and we all don't like it. Well, sorry, maybe I'm being generalizing just from my own
Um,
paranoia, but
it's quite
having
true.
other people, having other professionals in the language teaching classroom isn't something that many teachers are particularly comfortable with because we do it ourselves. We do it in private. You know, one of my favorite lines with my own students is that they know far more about how my colleagues teach than I do. I don't know. I've got an idea, but I don't really know. But they see them. I don't. That kind of stuff. So I find that quite an interesting idea that teachers and teaching is a relatively isolated profession, and yet we try and have teacher associations and discussions of teaching,
Mhm.
Yeah.
but we do it all through words and literature and publications and things like that. So that's the first issue. Coming down to another 2 points arising, I think it was Ernest Caro said, and it was with regard to using the first language in the classroom, which as I think Jose, that's one of my sort of things that I quite like. But he was talking about that practice, which for years was overlooked, even banned, and he just said, yeah, it was overlooked or banned, but it was happening. And he just said, guilt is a terrible starting point for a teacher. You think you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So when we close the door, we do something, but that wasn't in the teacher training program, and you have this idea, I don't want anybody to know about that, and yet half the profession are doing it. So that's quite another sort of offshoot. But I think one of the interesting points of literature, but one of the interesting points for teachers to hear what other teachers do, is to know that what they're doing is typical. It's
Mhm.
okay. Oh, other people do it. A phrase which I always quite like, the shock of recognition. Oh, right, they do that too, with the emphasis on the word too,
Yeah.
T-double-O. Oh, right, okay, if they do it, oh, maybe I'm not so bad. That kind of thing. So I think to follow up on your point, Kevin, the idea that we, and I'm using we in terms of the whole profession, not my
Hmm.
particular role in it, we can learn from what other teachers do. I think that's really, really valuable. I think the challenge with that is to make other teachers' voices heard. I
Yeah.
think certainly.
Yeah, I think we.
Yeah, we lost connection there for a
Oh,
second.
sorry.
Yeah, now you're back. Now you're back. Yeah, I
All
think we
right.
just lost you for a second.
Where did you get to? What was I rambling on about?
No, I think it was the like. Yeah, you were saying. I just
It's
lost
Having
having
focus.
having teachers
Having
having
teachers.
teachers' voices heard.
teachers'
Yes.
voices, and it certainly is in South America. That there's some great publications which emerge from the experiences of expert or champion teachers,
Yeah.
which are
Mm,
available for free, and we can read what teachers are doing. And, oh, right, okay, they're doing that. I could try that. Or, oh,
Yeah.
right, they're doing that. So do I. So
Yeah.
that's really good. I think the challenge with all of that is teachers aren't paid to write or
Mm.
produce
yeah.
publications. And
Or have the time.
yeah, and they don't have the time. So that's absolutely not to say that teachers shouldn't. Teachers should if they can and if they want to.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I'm very wary of the obligation to say, hey, teachers, just share your experiences. You know, maybe teachers do, maybe teachers don't. But I'm of the sort of end of the scale which says, well, maybe if people really want to go for it. But so we've got a professional problem, haven't we? We think
Mm,
that hearing teachers' voices is really valuable. It's really valuable for teachers' own development to express what they do. It's really valuable for teachers listening to learn from and to gain validation and gain new ideas. And yet it's really difficult to implement because of things like time, money,
yeah.
motivation,
Sure.
Just
routes
structural issues,
yeah, structural issues. Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Well,
So
I mean, yeah.
it's tricky.
Yeah. No, so Graham, you gave like a really graphic, or you painted a really graphic image of like, a teacher closing a door. And this is your world, you know. Do you still think that classrooms are really complicated places, or do you think that the ELT classroom has changed a lot? I mean, we're in 2025 now. One teacher, maybe a couple of learners, more learners. How do you
Yeah,
visualize this ELT classroom
I
now?
so I think as a kind of point of principle, there's so many things going on in the classroom that are
Mm,
intangible that it remains complex. Do people like each other?
mm,
Do people want to speak to each other? Are people tired? Is it Friday afternoon?
mm.
Is there any relevance to the task? I think it's quite a tricky place to navigate if you think about it, but we don't think about it so much, and we kind of wade in and things happen. That said, obviously, well, again, it depends on context. I mean, and you'll know far more about Chile than me, but even the advent of mobile phones and translation devices, and when mobiles first came into the world, as they are now, smartphones, I was just put away from your desk. We don't want those out because they're just a distraction. And of course, over time, you realize that they can be a fantastic tool for that
Mm,
shortcut, and you don't want to rely on them. But there's a little piece of vocabulary, or you want people to look something up. There's a fantastic research
Absolutely.
device. So I mean, in my own teaching, I've certainly changed in the last 6 or 7 years from no phones for all the kind of traditional reactionary reasons to somebody I can really see a role for them in a limited, principled way.
Yeah.
But it's an added layer of complexity, isn't it? Who thinks
Yeah.
that's the right thing to do, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you let phones into the classroom, then are they used in a way that you want, or when your back's turned, do they come out?
Yeah.
So do I think do I still think classrooms are complicated places? Yeah, I do. I think we don't think of them in those terms, but I think if you're a teacher, think of all the things you have to manage.
Yeah.
I think it's
mm,
I think they become second nature over time. But if you can think back to your own first few weeks as a teacher. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
My lesson plans were about 10 pages. I mean,
Yes,
they were
absolutely.
just
Yeah.
enormous. They had the target. These were the days. This was the mid-90s. They had the sort of the language point that I was trying to teach. They had every concept question written out. They had my introduction. I had everything on them. They were enormous. But obviously, it becomes more habitual over time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. But let's say so, do you think like now, with especially after the pandemic where we had like, classes online, do you think
Yeah.
it's still like this idea of like if people think of a language classroom where you have like one instructor and and some learners, or do you think now like for example with I don't know, with massive online courses where you can have like a massive audience, or do you think that this has changed a lot?
Ha! I don't know. I don't know. I think it'll depend on the context and things like that. That's an easy get out for me. I think. What do I think? Since we all went back to see after the pandemic, I've gone back to face, so I haven't been doing any online teaching, which
Mm.
I have to say, as an individual and my own character, I much prefer that, just because gets you out and about and all that sort of stuff. Um, Obviously, though, I'm as aware and as will you be of how much online teaching is going on. I don't know enough about it. Speaking to people. Um, I don't know. I can. I find it difficult to visualize how, if we're trying to do a sort of communication-based task, I find it hard to visualize how that works online in quite the same way. That's not to say it's necessarily worse, but I don't know. What's your genuinely what to throw this back at you? If you teach online, what's your experience of it? If you, I can see for presentational reasons it's fine,
Sure.
but for
Sure. No, for
practical
teaching, I think
practice
it,
reasons,
yeah, I think it was complicated, like as you were saying, for very specific tasks. And also if you had like a large group, it was either you had like breakout rooms and things like that, but it was not the same. I mean, you had to jump from room to room, but I think for maybe 2%, I think it's or like to have a conversation like this, but like teaching properly, I don't think that's the way it happens. I don't know. What would you say to that, Kevin?
Um, no, I think it's changed quite a lot. And I personally prefer face to face as well, for all the obvious reasons, being interaction, communication, and just being a bit more hands-on, like being there, sharing a physical context. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I don't. In saying this, I don't want to alienate the many listeners who teach online,
No, absolutely.
and it works.
Yeah,
But for me, having not really experienced that since the pandemic, um, yeah, it's just a very different thing. That
yeah,
said, I mean, I have engaged with language learning apps and the gamification of it all,
yeah,
and there's a place for it clearly, and it's going away from the kind of idealistic world of what is method and what can we learn about. I mean, every learner has a sorry, no, that's not quite true. Learners in schools have a slightly different motivation, don't they?
yeah, yeah,
It's part of the curriculum, it's part of the syllabus,
yeah,
They have
they,
to.
they have to. If we talk about learners outside of schools doing it slightly more
yeah,
autonomously and wanting to, then there's clearly a place for the idea that you can access some online stuff and
yeah,
just do it in your own
yeah,
time. I mean, my not so much myself, but my daughters, they're big into their apps, and
yeah,
they suggest that it works for them
yeah,
in a way that it didn't quite work for me. So I think it slightly goes back to our discussion of AI a few minutes ago. I think technology and online availability will change the ways in which people try to learn,
Mhm. I
and I
think,
think that will have an impact on teachers and teaching.
sure. No, I think you raised something very, very interesting point there. It really does depend on the context, doesn't it? Like, as you said, if we are talking about young learners and a state curriculum kind of dictating, prescribing what needs to be taught, and in some cases how, this kind of makes teacher autonomy
Yeah.
and teacher agency a rather narrow concept, because they can't just do what they want, or what they think is effective. However, if we go into tertiary and adult education, structures seem to be, and I talk from experience, having taught in adult education, goodness me, for about 15 years now. There, you get a book, you get an idea of what you want to achieve or what you
Yes.
need to achieve. It's like, right now, in my experience at least, use the book as a resource, but also do what you think is best for your context. So you have a lot more freedom and a lot more opportunities to actually exercise teacher autonomy, teacher agency, in that center, that context.
And if you're away from a compulsory curriculum as a learner, I guess you're looking for cost, time, convenience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, so when we discuss method and post method, like I say, it's quite idealistic. How language is learned, what do you want to do, blah 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 blah. But fundamentally, for many people, clearly, and especially with English, which many people are learning for career-based instrumental reasons, not because they want to take a holiday in Britain necessarily. Cost, convenience, and time necessary, and I think that's a really important thing. And I think what do I think? I have to be quite guarded because I'm sort of talking impressionistically. I think online providers and providers based around AI and algorithms and technology will continue to emphasize cost, time, and availability, and that's what learners will look at.
Yeah.
And then that has implications for how much face-to-face delivery ends up taking place. That might end up as being kind of the icing on the cake. Come along for your face-to-face, having built a platform of online. And I'm not saying this is fantastic. I'm saying this in with quite a pessimistic mode. Just to clarify, I'm not selling this as my dream model for the future. But I can see that's the way it goes. And again, this is slightly drawing on the work of Philip Kerr. Technology tends to drive costs down, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's why it's implemented. And we know and this is all taken from Philip, we know where the costs for language institutions are, their staffing costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And also
sorry, this is taking us down a deep, dark hole, which you probably
and Graham, and thinking about, let's say, the role of the teacher. For example, going from this idea, maybe starting with you need to teach English and using this specific method. Now, do you think this role has changed or evolved in, let's say, over the past 20 years to something that's more, okay, I'm going to use whatever helps, or I'm going to take anything. If I see something, I should try it out. How do you think that the role of the teacher has changed or evolved?
Okay, I think there's two answers. In the ideal world, it would be, teachers are seeing something they think will work and they'll try it out. In the practical world, and again, it's very contextual, it depends, and all the rest of it. There's the argument, isn't there, that as the emphasis on a single method as the way of teaching faded from the professional discourse, let's say, it's been replaced by textbook-led practice. So, and again, I'm probably too detached from too many language classrooms to know for sure, but certainly I recall, there's your textbook, there'll be an assessment at the end of the 10 weeks, get through to unit 7.
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of strong argument in there that teachers perhaps are no longer thinking in terms of what method am I following, and I would be surprised if many teachers in the world are thinking, well, I teach through task-based learning. Some will, of course, but that's not how. You're thinking, okay, it's unit 7. Here we go.
Yeah.
And that's not to deride teachers. Of course, that's what you do because you've got goals and aims. So whether teachers think through the methodological implications of each task in a unit, I think most probably don't need to, don't want to, don't have to. Why would you?
Yeah.
However, if you get to the stage where you do have time or you do want to think a little more about your teaching reflection, then you can say, okay, so they're doing this kind of thing in this task. I wonder why they're doing that. But that's for many teachers, that's a luxury, you know? Absolutely, that's a luxury. So again, I think it depends who you are, where you are. If you're a freelance teacher taking on your own students, then of course you make decisions for what works. But if you're following a secondary curriculum, then probably less so.
Yeah.
Again, in the Chilean context, I'm not sure, but my guess is that if teachers work in a secondary school, there's we know what the final year assessment is,
Yeah.
and there is a core text.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And teachers, possibly many teachers possibly have more than one job. So why are you
Yeah.
going to think through the mechanics underpinning each unit?
Absolutely.
And,
Well, you
and
did.
it's really sad, isn't it? But
Yeah, you raised an interesting point there when you talked about like reflection.
Yeah.
How do you think should teachers be encouraged to reflect about their practices, and maybe also the focus of what they reflect on
yeah,
changes
well, I think that's very
massively
interesting.
depending on the context where they're teaching, right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I've got a my own slightly trite, slightly superficial series of reflective questions, and I think they can kind of be applied by any teacher to any kind of aspect of their classroom. And the first question is, what do I do? Because half the time
Mm.
in the hurly-burly of a classroom, you don't, if you come out like, oh, what do I do? So how much do you do this, or what do you do when a learner does that? So I think the first thing is in a well, I won't say a teacher. Let's talk for me. First question is what do I actually do? And then the second question is why do I do that? And but you can't do the whys until you know what you do. And I don't, and I think it's really hard to pin down. So what do I do? Why do I do that? And then the next question is, where do those ideas come from? Do they come from teacher training, initial teacher training? Do they come from my own experience? Do they come from a conversation with a colleague in the staff room? Do they come from something I've read? So that's so what do I do? Why do I do it? Where do those ideas come from? And then the next question takes us right back to the beginning. What other things could I do? Would be my fourth
Mm.
question. That's where we draw in more information from expert teachers or other teacher development opportunities or reading online. And I think this is a key question that's underpinned all our discussions. Would the alternatives be more effective in my context?
Yeah.
Because they might not be. And I think that's the key. That's the key to it all. Is what do I do? Why do I do it? Where did these ideas come from? What other ideas are there? Would they work?
Yeah.
And then you can do that. Well, would they work in theory? And then what are the other institutional constraints that would stop me doing it,
Yeah.
or would let me do it? And so I think, for example, what should teachers focus on? I think you can do that at almost every level. What kind of readings do I want to give students, and what kind of activities do I want them to do? What do I do? How much
Mm.
time do I give them to do it? Do I get bored halfway through a reading because their classroom's silent, and do I start talking in the middle of it because I'm just a bit uncomfortable with a silent classroom? I mean, that was an interesting thing when I found myself doing it, and then why do I do that? And what else could I do? So it could be something from reading. How much time do I give? How much how much wait time do I give for learners to give an answer? That's a really interesting one, isn't it? How much do I
Absolutely.
jump in and fill the gaps, or how much do I move on to the other student to try and find the answer when a student's struggling to work out what they want to say? And
Mhm.
so you can do it from the micro scale. Going back, Kevin, you mentioned sort of conversations in class
Yeah.
Yeah.
and micro interactions from the micro scale. What happens here, and how do I want to do it? Through to the bigger picture, how do I want to run a task? How do I want to? What's my basis for thinking learners learn anything in my classroom? That sort of thing. So for me, it's just to see, it's a sort of slightly superficial series of questions that if a teacher can find the time just to work
Yeah,
through. But the first one is what do I do, and why do I do that?
absolutely. Yeah,
Is it because that's the way I was taught?
yeah. Or this is something
Or
that
Which
that's this, yes, something that actually works for me, or something I've seen, or
yeah,
something I would like to try.
yeah,
yeah. But then if I would like to try it, is being able to try it possible
Mm,
given the
yep,
constraints?
yeah,
yeah,
Um, so that's yeah, but it's difficult, isn't it? Because all that takes time, or takes energy or effort.
indeed. And
Um,
that's one of the big problems that we have in the profession, right? Like when we talk about the professional aspects of teaching, um, classrooms, full classrooms, big classrooms, relatively packed hours and schedules. Do teachers actually have the time to experiment, to try things out, or are they just happy to, or happy like is the focus mainly on getting the contents across in the best way possible, given all the restrictions that they may be facing in their context?
well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because um, we would like to think, wouldn't we, that we have the desire to innovate and experiment in our classrooms and try things
Mm.
out. And certainly, in our working lives, most people will have tried one or two things, maybe all the time, who knows? But it's interesting what I'm going to say forces, that's not quite the right word. What issues in our working lives also restrict our
Mm.
desire to innovate. So, for example, um, two elements I can think of are obviously assessment and student feedback.
yeah,
Student feedback
Yeah,
on my professional practice,
yeah,
the anonymized end of it. It's only in some contexts, so it's probably not in a secondary or primary school, but in a higher education
yeah,
institution. At the end of the course, the students fill in an anonymous questionnaire. How is the module? That's how it works in the UK.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so, if you found an activity that works, and you found that 5 years ago, and the students generally like the classes, and they generally do okay in the assessments, then you're not going to change the activity, are you?
yeah,
yeah,
Because you've got two things that work in your favor.
yeah,
And so, well, you might if you're a braver person than me, but if you've got something, why would you? If you work in an institution that looks at student feedback and looks at your assessment results and you're evaluated on those two issues, and you've got something that you know works, then why would you change it? Again,
yeah,
this is me just being horribly pessimistic. In an ideal world, you would change it, but then you're taking a professional risk, aren't you?
yeah, absolutely.
So um, I think it's just the realities of things. So we would all like to think we're innovative. And going back to your issue question, Jose, earlier, I think classrooms are complicated. So every class is different. Every
Yeah,
year, he says it's different. So
yeah,
so you're always changing, you're always reacting, everything is different, you're always moving on and doing things differently. But do you introduce a major innovation? Well,
mm,
you do if you think it's going to work. Do you do it experimentally? You do if you've got the freedom to be experimental, but do you experiment if you've got those professional institutional pressures on you? I'm not so sure that, well, you might do, but the logical rationale is that you might not.
yeah,
So lots of our institutional professional setup is we're in a strange profession, aren't we? We're in a profession that thinks itself as being really innovative, and we get all of these kind of, you know, new course books and new ideas and all this, that, and the other, and that's fantastic. But on the other hand, the profession's also set up for many people to inhibit individual innovation because
mm,
there's an inherent risk.
yeah,
It's a strange situation we're navigating, I think.
yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
coming out as being a real pessimist. I didn't mean to. I'm a real optimist. It's great.
We have,
honestly,
yeah, but I mean, yeah, I think,
I don't mean to sound miserable because actually I think language teaching is fantastic. It's
no,
such a
it
great
is.
thing.
But I think we are in like in very like I don't know changing times, and I think that that's also something I think like one of the main issues is well like something you were saying like teachers are trying to do what they can, and also like the advent of artificial intelligence or LLMs has let's say has been a really big influence. So that's why maybe like our next question can be like in your opinion, if you have to think, maybe I don't know if less pessimistically, what?
I'll think optimistically.
All right, what does the future of ELT look like in your opinion?
Okay, I think what does it look like? What do I hope it looks like?
Yeah,
I hope that I think a process has generally started whereby I'm gonna stereotype and be very broad brushing. I think this idea that English is owned by native speaker teachers, and the
yeah,
idea that native speaker teachers are well, native speakiness is a problematic concept. We won't do that now. The idea that British and American English and British and American teachers are necessarily everything to be aspired to. I think that has gone or is almost going.
yeah,
Okay. I clearly
In some
recognize,
parts of the world, yeah.
yeah. But I
Yeah.
clearly recognize that many learners still want British and American English models, but I think there's
Mhm.
progress. Look at that word. There's change. I shouldn't you say progress? There's change to the idea that there are many varieties and different varieties might be valid for people in different contexts. And I think there's an idea, hopefully, permeating that what matters to be a good teacher is to be a good teacher, not where you're
yeah,
born.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's definitely taking hold in some contexts and many institutions, although we can still see problematic examples, in my opinion, where that's not. So I think over the course of time, that will continue, and I think that's clearly a good thing. That the profession will be decentered, that local knowledge will be more widely recognized, and I think
Mhm.
teacher knowledge hopefully will be more widely recognized. I think I think the pessimism that might have permeated some of my answers has really been about the sort of institutional nature of the profession, um, in terms of the way that teachers are employed, basically. However, I think the broad trends from you know global north to global majority countries, I think that will I hope that will continue because I think that's where the future is. As I said earlier, how can somebody on the northeast coast of England know or advise? You can only know and advise if you're there. So I think they're really positive and optimistic trends which I suppose lead to ideas to do with autonomy, local knowledge, and all the rest of it. So a decentering, hopefully. Of course, there's always notes of caution and this, that, and the other. Global course books and global trends will be with us for a long time in the future. But let's hope those changes continue. In terms of the classroom, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Clearly, a major change has been the accessibility of English outside of the classroom in many contexts through online social media and all the rest of it. Whereas, I mean, I noted earlier you mentioned EFL context, this idea,
Mm.
where there isn't English in the local environment in, say, Chile or I don't know, Ethiopia or what have you. Um, if technology is available to learners, then English is available.
Yeah.
And
No.
I think that's a massive change compared to 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, 20 years ago, you could kind of make this distinction, couldn't you, between sort of an EFL context
yeah,
or a context where there was English outside of the classroom. So English, that was a justification for a lot of English only teaching, wasn't it? There's no English outside, so the exposure of the learners to English has to take place in those classroom hours.
yeah,
Whereas now, if a learner has a smartphone and has data that
yeah.
they can
That's
afford,
yeah.
then they can access English in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's massive. and it has big implications for what we
Mhm.
might do. Maybe outside of the classroom, learners engage with the sort of more informal elements of English, and the classroom becomes, I don't know, this sounds very reactionary, becomes more grammar focused. The bits that you don't get when you're just doing your sort of self access and watching YouTube and TikTok. Although I'm not the TikTok generation. I'm sure the English language on TikTok. I'm just showing my age. So I think there's all sorts of trends towards autonomy and decentering and local knowledge and practitioner knowledge and all of those things, and yet there's these forces of making uh, restricting opportunities for teacher development because we can just give them a course book, can't we?
No, that's true. And I think there is a lot of change happening, and maybe I don't know. We see the classroom more as a mediator, as a mediating
Yes,
function rather than
that's a much
language
better.
contact.
You said in one word what it took me 5 minutes to waffle about.
I was thinking about it for 5 minutes, so it's all right.
Yeah, I think that idea of the classroom as a mediating context, I think that's really interesting. Really interesting. So but that takes the idea that learners will be engaging with English outside of the classroom, which some will, depends who they are and
Yeah.
how motivated they are. That's a
Yeah,
really interesting idea, isn't it?
yeah.
Because English surrounds us.
Well, we'll see how where we go in the future. If I can, and you said it a few times during this podcast, but I will still try to tease out an answer here.
Carry on.
You said
I avoided the question by any chance.
sure. You said that you're hesitant to give from the East Coast, from the northeast of England.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
hesitant to give advice and tips of what could work in a very remote context. But if
Oh,
you
right.
allow me
Okay.
the question, are there
Yeah.
any
Okay.
tips that you can give to students or teachers on how to run the classroom or how to further their knowledge in contexts that are far away from, in your case, shall we say, the northeast of
Yeah.
England?
Yeah. How to further their knowledge of teaching or further their knowledge of English?
Whichever you're more comfortable answering, or
Oh.
both.
So I think with regard to furthering knowledge of English per se, it
Hmm.
depends on technology, but I think there's just so many opportunities with videos. As I say, I mean I mock, but I don't mean to. TikTok, YouTube, newspaper sites,
Yeah.
Yeah,
media sites, BBC. There's tons of language learning stuff online. If somebody has the material resources and time to look to access English,
yeah,
it's everywhere. However, many places don't, and that's a limit to that answer. Um, I think in terms of teaching, it's difficult, isn't it? Because contexts vary so massively. I think that I think an interesting philosophical question is the extent to which teaching does depend on the personal characteristics of the individual teacher,
mm,
or it can be trained.
Yeah.
yeah,
So we in teacher education, we obviously think that teacher education means that we can produce good teachers.
Mm.
Otherwise, However, sometimes I do wonder whether there is that intangible. I think students know if teachers aren't really interested.
Mm.
I think they can. I
Yes.
think students of any age can sniff it
Yeah.
out if a teacher
It's interesting.
doesn't really want to be there.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, now this is really difficult, isn't it? Because we all have bad days
yeah.
and we all have bad moments. But I think I can't. I'm talking from a position of privilege because I've always enjoyed teaching, and I've been lucky to work in a context where, whilst there have been challenges, there are many more challenging contexts than the places that I've worked. But I think you've got to want to teach. I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
imagine much worse than being a teacher if you don't really like it.
Mm.
you're so exposed. It goes back to that point of closing the door.
Yeah.
It's got to be hard work if you don't enjoy being there and engaging with the learners. So obviously, there's all sorts of things about teaching, isn't there? But if we were to simplify, there's knowing the content and there's knowing how to teach, or being having a degree of proficiency, a degree of expertise in teaching. And a sort of thought experiment I've often given to my sort of students is who would you rather have teaching you? Would you rather have somebody who's an expert in the subject, or somebody who's a good teacher and less expert in the subject? And I kind of leave that floating, and I think my suspicion is most people would rather have somebody who's a great teacher and perhaps less expert than somebody who's an absolute expert but's not a great teacher.
Teacher.
And so I think this is an answer that applies to all contexts, although it is trite because people have different levels of challenge. But I think you've got to want to teach. You've got to want to be in there, and you've got to want to be with the learners, and you've got to want the learners to do well. And that sounds hugely idealistic and all of those things. But if you don't like it, you don't like the idea that you're helping your learners, then I think that must be a pretty hard job.
Yeah.
You've got to want them to do okay,
Yeah.
and you've got to want to be in there. That's not a top tip in some ways, but it's the way I sort of see it. So that plays out in things like, and again, it depends on the number of students in the class, but try and learn their names.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's a big class, it shows interest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say, because for most teachers, of course, that's obvious. But
Yeah.
if you've got a class of 50, it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you can't learn all the names, make a show of you trying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you get it wrong, take the mickey out of yourself, sort of thing. And that takes a degree of experience and confidence, and it's not for everybody. But all these sorts of things, and of course, I'm talking from a particular. I think you can show that you care about your students and show you want them to do well in different ways. It doesn't all have to be touchy-feely, humanistic, laugh a minute. You can show that even if you want to have a slightly more at the front teacher authority perspective. But you have to teach. I think students can just see it if you don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much so.
And it doesn't, and you can care. You can care in different ways. You don't have to say "I care" all the time. They just know. They can sniff it out. Sorry, this is so superficial. But
No, but I think it brings it all to the point, right? It all depends on how we manage the classroom, and
yes,
also
yes.
it's teaching aptitude. Are you a trained teacher or are you a born teacher?
Well, and this is the really difficult situation for us involved in teacher education, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
that's at the root of the issue. If you're just born a teacher, we might as well just pack up and go home, because
Exactly.
so these are really problematic philosophical issues for us all.
Yeah.
And clearly, teacher education can help people to develop and what have you. And again, just to iterate, to be a good teacher, there's different ways of being a good teacher, different ways of showing this. So it's not to propagate one particular model of
No.
teaching. But I think somewhere in there has to be that desire to want to teach.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And I think we have like one question from the audience. So from Beatriz Mihailidi. So, and this is something that maybe we can start finishing our conversation. Very interesting conversation. Very good point. Here, the question is: how do teachers develop post-method pedagogical strategies through learner-centered evaluation, collaboration, communication? How do you think teachers can actually develop some strategies based on post-method?
I think it's a good question. I think it brings together quite a lot of what we said. I think
Yes.
it involves teacher reflection, a degree of experimentation. It involves teacher rapport and cooperation with their learners. It involves teachers understanding their context. It involves talking to peers and talking to what people
Mm.
in your staff room, and maybe reading a little bit. But notice how much of an element of responsibility that places on teachers, and that's the criticism of
Yeah.
sort of post method approaches. So I think I'm sort of something we haven't really discussed is the idea that you might have moments in the classroom where you kind of you follow the usual sort of or the given course book or the given method, but then you think, okay, I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to try. This is my 10-minute experimental phase, my 10-minute post method phase, my 10 minutes where I'm going to let the language come from the students and flow for itself. And I think for most people, innovation, experimentation, development of practice, it can't be an all or nothing thing in a series of lessons. I mean, it's 1 foot at a time sort of stuff, I suspect. And so that idea, maybe I'm looking at the question through learner-centered evaluation, or ask the learners what they give the learners a choice.
Yeah.
Here's three things. Choose one of these three tasks. Or, we have to discuss this. How would you like to do that? But just once in a class, you can't do that all class because you never get anywhere.
Yeah.
But just how can teachers do that? Well, I suppose it's to be engaged with the field more generally, which is very trite. But then in practical terms, one step at a time. Here's the I've got 3 English language classes with this group in a week. In one of those classes, there's 15 minutes of we're going to try this. That lowers the risk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And maybe gets us somewhere. So I would go with that. How? Slowly, but slowly but systematically, if possible. I would guess is the way, because to use the British English idiom, which might be worldwide, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. It's almost like an informed trial and error, a well-educated trial and error.
Yeah. But it does go back to those questions I mentioned. What do I do? Why do I do? What are the alternatives? Will they work?
Yeah.
And maybe you could find out whether they work by spending 10, 15 minutes every so often experimenting. And if it works, great, you embed it, don't you? But if it doesn't, then move on. Sorts of things. So I think that really.
Thank you very much. Well, Graham, thank you very much for your time. This has been an very interesting conversation. I mean, probably, we could have continued. Probably we can talk about many more things. So we're going to be sharing. Yes.
I think teaching is so interesting, and so there's so many global and local issues. It's got issues of practical language acquisition, but it's got issues of politics and all sorts of stuff. You could talk about teaching for forever, really, because there's so many ways to go.
So we're actually going to be sharing some resources. There are some publications that you have, also a link to where people can actually buy your book, your latest book, and anything you would like to share with us. So Kevin, thank you very much. I don't know if you have any closing remarks, Kevin, or anything.
No, I just want to say it was a massive pleasure talking about teaching with you today, Graham, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it. I hope yourselves and anybody who ever picks up and listens to this will find it interesting in some way.
Thank you.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Take care then.